Hello, I'm Dave Bowden, the news editor at Ballotpedia, and I apologize that we've had some technical difficulties with Zoom. So earlier this week, we kind of resumed the election season, the primary election season, with a whole bunch of states having elections for primaries pretty much across the country. And so it's kind of been a weird election season in that with the pandemic and all the things that are going on, we had about half the states that held elections on June 2nd were originally scheduled for that date, and the other half of those states were elections that had been postponed from earlier in the spring. So we wanted to take this opportunity to kind of break all that stuff down. It was good for us at Ballotpedia to get back into working on elections, which we really haven't had as many of in the last few months. And so we want to take a look at what some of the key results were from Tuesday. Joining me to do that here is David Lukes, who is the team lead on our marquee team. So thank you very much for joining us here, David.
Dave, thanks for having me. It is great to be here.
Yeah, so this has been a busy week for us, obviously, at Ballotpedia. But first, let's look at something right off the top, and that is there were some states that held presidential primary elections. I think there were a handful of states, and all of those presidential primaries were won by either President Trump on the Republican side or former Vice President Joe Biden on the Democratic side. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right, Dave. And I do want to move to our congressional and state executive primaries, but if I could quickly sneak something in here. This was actually the last day on the presidential primary calendar where we had kind of a big primary day. There were 7 states in DC that held presidential primaries on Tuesday. Going forward, it's just kind of a scattered patchwork of just 1 or maybe 2 primaries at once. This was the last time a lot of those were happening all at once. We are now up to, on the Democratic side, just over 80% of delegates to the Democratic National Convention that have been allocated. Primary season is well and truly wrapping up.
All right, so that's a good sense as to where that race stands, and obviously we'll be hearing more about that as the conventions come up. All right, I know you're anxious to get right into these congressional and state executive races, and there's a lot to talk about. So let's start with a review of the Senate. There were 5 states that held Senate primaries on Tuesday. That included Idaho, Iowa, Montana, New Mexico, and South Dakota. And I know your team, the marquee team, identified one of those primaries, the Democratic primary for the U.S. Senate in Iowa, as a battleground. David, what can you tell us about that race?
Yeah, so this race for the Democratic nomination for U.S. Senate in Iowa is for a seat that had been held by a Democratic Senator, Tom Harkin, for 30 years before he ended up retiring in 2014, and Republicans took the seat. This year, Democrats are looking to take this Senate seat back. So there were 4 candidates who ran in this primary. The winner of the primary was Teresa Greenfield, and she did get 48% of the vote. The runner-up was Michael Franken, and he had 25%. One of the really interesting elements in this race was the involvement of national groups in the Democratic primary, in particular, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee. This is the official campaign arm of Senate Democrats, got involved in it, publicly endorsed Teresa Greenfield, the eventual winner. Now, she also had endorsements from 3 of the Democrats' presidential candidates, those being Pete Buttigieg, Amy Klobuchar, and Elizabeth Warren, as well as groups including the Iowa branch of the AFL-CIO and Emily's List. Michael Franken, that second place candidate with 25%, he was a retired vice admiral. He was endorsed by the Des Moines Register, as well as several political figures who have had a record of military service. This includes Representatives Elaine Luria, Seth Moulton, Ulysses Slotkin, as well as former Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, who served on the cabinet in the Obama administration. Now, there was a 5th candidate in this race, Cal Woods. He dropped out actually 1 month ago today on May 4th, and he endorsed Franken, but because he dropped out as late as he did, he was still on the ballot, and he did get just over 1% of the vote, so that's not enough that would have, that's substantially smaller than the margin between Greenfield and Franken. Now, the winner, Teresa Greenfield, she's going to be facing first-term Iowa Senator Joni Ernst, who was unopposed for renomination on the Republican side. And this race in November between Greenfield and Ernst is going to be one of the races that's likely to determine control of the US Senate. Right now, what election forecasters are saying is that this race leans towards Ernst, but we're certainly going to be keeping our eye on it through November.
Yeah, that was a very interesting primary. I know from all the things that I follow, there was a lot of attention being paid on that Iowa race. So thank you for that. Now, I forgot to mention we were talking about these 5 Senate primaries that were held on Tuesday. Just as an introduction, 4 of these races involve seats that are currently held by Republicans, and in each case, the Republican senator is running for re-election. And there is one seat that is being held by that's currently held by a Democrat who is actually not running for re-election, and thus has created an open seat. So let's talk about some of those other states, leading off with the open seat contest in New Mexico. So David, what can you tell us about that one?
Yeah, certainly. So in New Mexico, Democratic Senator Tom Udall is not running for re-election. So as you say, this seat is open. On the Democratic side, Representative Ben Ray Lujan, he's a member of the US House from New Mexico. He won the nomination without opposition. On the Republican side, there were 3 candidates running in that primary. The winner was Mark Ronchetti, a former TV meteorologist. He won that primary with 53% of the vote. What general election forecasters are currently saying is that this seat, November general election, it's either likely or safely Democratic, meaning that Ben Ray Lujan is favored to win. Moving to Montana, incumbent Senator Steve Daines, who is a Republican, he's running for a second term. He did face 2 challengers in the Republican primary. He won with 88% of the vote. The Democratic primary also had 3 candidates in the running. One of them is actually the state's current governor, Steve Bullock. Governor Bullock's term expires at the end of this year. He's term limited, so he can't run for re-election as governor. He's now running for Senate. And Bullock won 96% of the vote in the Democratic primary, so he is going to be heading to the general election against Daines. And right now, what election forecasters are saying is that this November race does lean more in Daines's favor.
And like Iowa, this race is also viewed by many election forecasters as, one of those key races that's likely to determine control of the Senate, correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and this is interesting. It's one of these cases where the primaries really weren't that competitive, but the general election is going to be super competitive, especially with the name recognition of both of those 2 gentlemen in the state of Montana. All right, let's just talk briefly about the other 2 Senate primaries that happened on Tuesday.
Yeah, very quickly in Idaho, Senator Jim Risch is running for a 3rd term. He was unopposed in the Republican primary. On the Democratic side, there were 2 candidates in the running. The winner was Paulette Jordan. She's a former state legislator who might be known to state voters as the Democratic candidate for governor in 2018. She won that Democratic primary with 86%. Risch is favored to win the general election over Jordan and keep his seat. In South Dakota, Senator Mike Rounds is running for a 2nd term. In the Republican primary, he faced a single opponent and he won that primary with 75% of the vote. On the Democratic side, the primary was canceled because only one candidate, Dan Allers, filed. So Allers is going to be facing Rounds in the November election. Rounds is favored to win that election.
All right, so thank you very much. It's a great wrap up of those 5 Senate primaries that happened, and obviously we'll be keeping an eye on those things, those races as the year progresses. All right, so let's shift a little bit from the Senate, which we just kind of talked about, and then among the states that held elections on June 2, there were also 2 states that held primaries for governor. Now, there's much more governors' terms that are up in basically the midterm year, but there are about 10, 11, I think, that hold gubernatorial elections during a presidential year as well. So in Indiana, those primaries were uncontested. So there's going to be the November general election between Democrat Woody Myers and Republican Governor Eric Holcomb. And then the other race where there actually were competitive primaries, and I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about those, was in Montana, where we were looking at the primaries as battlegrounds on both sides. So David, what can you tell us about the Democratic primary?
Yeah, Dave. So as we mentioned briefly when we were talking about the Senate in Montana, the current Democratic governor of Montana, Steve Bullock, can't run for re-election this year. He's running for Senate instead. This leaves the seat open. So this Democratic primary pitted Bullock's Lieutenant Governor Mike Cooney against Whitney Williams. Cooney ended up winning that primary with 56% of the vote. Williams was a first-time candidate, but she does have a fair amount of name recognition among Montana voters as her parents both held elected office. Her mother, Carol, was the president of the state Senate and ran for lieutenant governor in 2000, and her father, Pat, represented Montana in the U.S. House for 18 years. Cooney's also got a long record of public service in Montana. He served in both chambers of the state legislature, and he served 3 4-year terms as Secretary of State between 1989 and 2001. In that race, Cooney had the support of the outgoing governor, Steve Bullock, one of the state's 2 U.S. senators, John Tester, Max Baucus, who was a former senator from Montana, as well as the Montana branch of the AFL-CIO. Williams, on the other hand, had support from Hillary Clinton, Brian Schweitzer, who is a former governor. He was the governor before Steve Bullock, as well as the national group Emily's List. Now, Cooney will be advancing to the general election alongside his running mate, Casey Schreiner, who is actually the minority leader in the State House of Representatives.
Yeah, that was very interesting, and that was actually a somewhat close primary as the results finally came out. Now, on the Republican side, we had U.S. Representative Greg Gianforte, and he defeated the State Attorney General Tim Fox, and then a state senator Al Olszewski, and Gianforte got 53% of the vote. So, what else can you tell us about what happened in the Republican primary?
Yeah, so Gianforte was the Republican nominee for governor in the last election in 2016 as well. And he was first elected to the House the following year in the special election in 2017. In this primary, Gianforte had support from Donald Trump Jr., the Susan B. Anthony list, and Gun Owners of America. The second place candidate was the State Attorney General, Tim Fox. Fox said that he was the candidate who was best suited to win the general election, defeat the Democratic nominee. He had the support of 29 of the 30 members of the state legislature's Solutions Caucus. This is an informal group of Republican legislators who have tended to join with Democrats on some recent votes, most notably on a vote to expand Medicaid coverage in Montana. Meanwhile, Olszewski said that he was the candidate who was the most faithful to the Montana GOP's platform. He was the candidate who would best execute Montana GOP policy. He had the most overall endorsements from state legislators. Gianforte did win that primary with 53% of the vote, so he's going to be advancing to the general election alongside his running mate, Kristen Jarris.
All right, so 2 really interesting, fascinating primaries, one on each side. What are some of the election forecasters saying about the general election?
Yeah, all 3 ratings agencies are saying that this race between Cooney and Gianforte is really going to be a toss-up. Montana does tend to back, on the presidential level, Republican candidates. So if you look back to World War II, Montana has backed the Democratic candidate 3 times since then. Harry Truman in 1948, LBJ in 1964, Bill Clinton in 1992. So it does tend to be favorable ground for Republicans in the presidential level. However, in terms of elections for governor, Democrats have tended to win those races in recent years. The most recent Republican to win election as governor of Montana was Judy Martz, and that was in 2000. One really interesting case to look at here would be the 2016 gubernatorial election. That's when Steve Bullock was running for re-election, and the current Democratic nominee, Mike Cooney, was his running mate for lieutenant governor. And he was running against Gianforte, who's running again this year. That year, Bullock and Cooney won by a margin of 4 percentage points over Gianforte, while in the same election, Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton in the state by 21 percentage points. So it's going to be very interesting to see what ends up happening in Montana this year. This is another one we're really going to be keeping an eye on all throughout the year.
Yeah, I think Montana's elections are going to be fascinating this year because, as we talked about with the Senate race and as we talk about with this race, all 4 major party nominees on each, 2 on each side for those 2 state level races are all extremely well known, and so it's just really going to be, usually you have name recognition differences and whatnot that different candidates are trying to overcome. Here, I think it's going to be the case that pretty much everybody knows these folks. So it's going to be a really fascinating campaign to watch. So all right, so that's a great look at the governors that were decided on Tuesday. Now let's turn our attention to the House, and there were a lot of primaries in House districts that took place on Tuesday. There were actually 44 in total. We identified 10 of those as battlegrounds. Obviously, we can't go through them all, but one of those primaries saw an incumbent, Representative Steve King in Iowa, lose renomination. So, David, what can you tell us about what happened in that primary?
Yeah, that's right, Dave. So this race took place in Iowa's 4th congressional district. Iowa right now has 4 congressional districts, and these roughly correspond to quadrants if you look at the map of the state. So the 4th district is in the northwestern quadrant. Steve King was first elected from this district in 2002. He faced 4 challengers, including the eventual winner, State Senator Randy Feenstra, who received 46% of the vote to 36% for King. Now, King's challengers, Feenstra in particular, said that King was not an effective congressman because he had been stripped of his committee assignments by House Republican leadership. Now, for King's part, he said that he was under attack because of his record of policy achievements and that he would regain his assignments if he was reelected. In the general election, Feenstra is favored to defeat Democratic nominee J.D. Scholten, who the party also ran against King in 2018.
And King is just the second member of the House to so far lose in his primary this year. The first one was back in March, which literally feels like a year ago, but it was just in March, I promise, and that was when Illinois Democrat Dan Lipinski lost to Marie Newman in March, and that was a rematch of their 2018 race. So in general, David, how common is it for members of Congress to lose in their primary?
It's not particularly common, Dave. In 2018, there were 4 members of the House who lost renomination, 2 from each party. Both of the 2 Democrats who lost renomination ended up losing to members of what would eventually become known as the Squad. There was Joseph Crowley in New York, who was unseated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and there was Michael Capilano in Massachusetts, who was unseated by Ayanna Pressley. The other 2 were Republicans. Robert Pittenger in North Carolina was defeated by Mark Harris, and Mark Sanford in South Carolina was defeated by Katie Harrington. And if we go back as far as 2004 and just look at the number of incumbent members of the House who were unseated in primaries, 4 is actually the number that we see most often, 4 incumbents defeated in primaries. There are only 2 cycles that had more incumbents defeated in that. There was 2012 when there were 13 House incumbents unseated. This was the first round of elections after the redistricting following the 2010 census. So the districts have kind of been jumbled up. And then 2016 had 5. On the low end, 2004 and 2006 were kind of the low point if we look at 2004 to the present for congressional primary defeats. Those cycles had 2 defeated incumbents each. So if nothing else, then we are at 2.
All right, so 4 or 5, 2 to 5 seems to be the sweet spot in this decade. If you exclude the cycle that happened right after redistricting. All right, so let's just swing around the country real quick to some of the other House races that we were really focusing on as battlegrounds. The first couple that we want to talk about were in Indiana. So there was a Democratic primary in the 1st district up north, and there was a Republican primary in the 5th district in and around Indianapolis. So in the 1st district, Frank Mervan won the Democratic nomination out of a field of 15 candidates. So what else can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so this is a historically Democratic district in the Chicago metropolitan area. As you say, it's in Indiana's northwest corner. The Democrat who currently represents that district, Pete Visclosky, is not seeking re-election this year. And there were 15 candidates, and what's really interesting is Indiana is not one of the states that has primary runoffs. So whichever candidate got the most votes was going to advance directly to the general election. Of those 15 candidates, there were only 2 who got significant traction. One of them was the eventual winner, Frank Mervan, who was a trustee of the township of North. And the other one was Thomas McDermott Jr., who was the mayor of Hammond, Indiana. Mervan ended up getting 34% of the vote. Thomas McDermott Jr. got 29%. What made this primary really interesting, though, is that this is actually the first time that this seat has been left open since 1932. Pete Visclosky was first elected after defeating incumbent Representative Katie Hall in the 1984 Democratic primary. Representative Hall was first elected by defeating a Democrat in the primary, and so on and so forth, all the way back to 1932. What the general election forecasters are saying is that Mrvan is likely to defeat the Republican nominee, Mark Leva. This is a district that historically has leaned towards Democrats.
It's very fascinating. This is the first time it was an open seat since 1932. I mean, that's like 88 years or something like that, which is crazy. All right, and now what happened in the 5th district in the central part of the state?
Yeah, so the 5th district is a suburban district located to the north and northeast of Indianapolis. Historically, this is a Republican district, although the current incumbent, Susan Brooks, is retiring, and the Democrats' official campaign arm is actually targeting this district in November. They think that they have a shot at flipping this district. And actually, just by coincidence, just like in the Democratic primary in the 1st district, the Republican primary in the 5th district also had 15 candidates in the running. And the winner in this race was first-term state senator Victoria Sparks. She won with 41% of the vote. There were 2 other candidates who had more than 10%. Those were Beth Henderson, who had 18%, and Micah Beckwith, who had 14%. One of the really interesting things about this race is that more than 90% of the spending from outside groups came from a single source. That was the Club for Growth, which had endorsed the eventual winner, Victoria Sparks. Club for Growth spent to oppose Beth Henderson, the 2nd place finisher, as well as Carl Ritzie. Sparks will end up facing Democrat Christina Hale, who's a former state representative, in the general election. 2 election forecasters are saying that this race is leaning towards Sparks, and then there's a third that's saying that she's quite likely to win.
Wow, it is amazing that both races had 15 candidate primaries. Those are some really, really big fields, and as you mentioned, without runoffs, you don't need to get a majority. You just need to get the plurality there. All right, so switching from Indiana, let's move almost all the way across the country down to the Southwest, and we can hopefully take a look a little bit at New Mexico, which has 3 congressional districts, and 2 of them had primaries that we had identified as battlegrounds. There was the Republican primary in the 2nd district and the Democratic primary in the 3rd. And the Republican primary saw Yvette Harrell, who was also the 2018 nominee, beat Claire Chase and Chris Mathis for the nomination. And I believe this sets up a rematch of the election, obviously in 2018. What more can you tell us about this race?
Yeah, so just for some quick context, as you see in the map, New Mexico has 3 congressional districts. Currently, Democrats hold all 3. In recent history, however, the 2nd district, that's that southern district, has typically been represented by Republicans. The last Democrat to hold that seat for more than 1 term was Harold Runnels back in the 1970s. So in 2018, the incumbent Steve Pierce made an unsuccessful run for governor, leaving that seat open. Yvette Harrell, who won the primary this Tuesday, was the Republican nominee that year as well. That year, she lost to Democrat Xochitl Torres Small by just under 2 percentage points. This year, the primary was really characterized by the sharp and at times personal back and forth between Harrell and Chase, who both said that the other was not loyal to President Trump. In the end, Harrell did win with 45% of the vote to 32% for Chase. And as you say, there is going to be a rematch between her and Xochitl Torres Small in November.
Yeah, and this clearly is going to be one of those races, especially because of the margin from last term. Again, both candidates are very well known from their run 2 years ago. This one will be a key race in determining which party controls the House of Representatives. Now, if we just look at the other half of the state, the top half of the state, we also were looking at the Democratic primary in that 3rd district. And this is the seat that had been held by Ben Ray Lujan, who is, as you mentioned before, is running for the U.S. Senate. This is historically a Democratic seat. The winner of the Democratic primaries is generally going to be very strongly favored. And then there was attorney Teresa Leger Fernandez won with 42% of the vote. What else was noteworthy about this race?
Yeah, so there were 7 candidates in the running. Other than Fernandez, the top 2 vote getters were Valerie Plame, who had 23%, and Joseph Sanchez, who had 14%. Fernandez had the support of a lot of national figures, including Senator Elizabeth Warren, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, a whole lot of national groups as well, including the Sierra Club, Emily's List, and the Working Families Party. Valerie Plame, the 2nd place vote getter, might be familiar to some viewers as the former CIA agent whose identity was revealed by a White House aide back in 2003. She was the top fundraiser. She raised $2 million as of May 13th, and that's compared to 1.3 million for Fernandez. If we look towards the general election, historically speaking, this is a Democratic seat, so Fernandez is expected to win that general election.
That's very interesting. And again, this is one of those races where the primary may be a lot more interesting than the general. And obviously with the recognition for Valerie Plame, I know there was a lot of talk about what was happening in this district. All right, before we wrap up, I want to focus on just one more House district, and that is not too far away from where I am right now in northwestern New Jersey. It's across the river in the Lehigh Valley area of Pennsylvania. And that is Pennsylvania's 7th congressional district, and it's another one of those districts that had a really close general election last time that will be central to who controls the House of Representatives. So on the Republican side here, Lisa Scheller defeated Dean Browning to become the Republican nominee and to challenge the incumbent there. Can you tell us any more about this race, David?
Yeah, so this was a one-on-one race between, as you say, Lisa Scheller and Dean Browning. Both Scheller and Browning are former members of the Lehigh County Board of Commissioners. Their terms of service didn't overlap. They just missed one another, but they did sit on the same county board. Scheller had the endorsement of President Trump, and unlike Browning, she had also qualified for the National Republican Congressional Committee's Contenders Program. Very briefly, this is one of several programs that the House Republicans' official campaign arm has set up where campaigns can essentially apply and try and demonstrate that they've met certain fundraising and organizational standards. And if they can demonstrate that, then they'll receive some additional support. So unlike Browning, Scheller did qualify for that additional level of support. She did end up defeating Browning 52% to 48%. On the Democratic side, the incumbent, Susan Wild, was unopposed. And election forecasters are somewhat split in their assessment of what this race might look like in November. Two of them are saying that the race leans somewhat towards Wild, and the third is actually saying that Wild is quite likely to win. So it's going to be very interesting to see what ends up happening. And just more broadly, Pennsylvania's primaries this week were a little interesting to cover because complete results aren't going to be fully available until next week. The governor, Democrat Tom Wolf, extended the absentee ballot return deadline in 6 of Pennsylvania's most populous counties to June 9th, next Tuesday, in order to allow for disruptions to the Postal Service due to civil unrest. Separately, state courts also extended the absentee ballot return deadline in 2 counties because those counties weren't able to mail out every mail-in ballot that had been requested on time. So we're not expecting that we're going to have full, complete Pennsylvania results until some point early next week.
All right, that's fascinating. There's a lot of very interesting races to look at. And you did touch on something that I had neglected to mention in the opening, is that many of the states that did hold voting on June 2nd did so on under modified procedures, either with regard to absentee or mail-in ballots, or absentee or mail-in ballot applications. So that was also a theme that kind of affected almost all of these races, is the extent to which the procedures had to be modified because of the coronavirus pandemic. All right, we're almost done, and I apologize for running a little bit longer than we normally do. We had some of those technical difficulties in the beginning, but I wanted to touch on the fact that Tuesday's primaries also featured contests for state legislative seats in all of those states, in fact, 7 in total. These races can sometimes take a little bit longer to call, and our team at Ballotpedia is still kind of processing and waiting for some of these final results. But can you give us a preliminary total of how many state legislative incumbents lost their primaries on Tuesday?
Yeah, so we know that there have been 25 incumbents so far that we know have been defeated. As you say, that number is preliminary. It is somewhat likely to increase as we call more races. Just for comparison, in 2018, if we look at these same 7 states that had 25 incumbents defeated on Tuesday, in 2018, those 7 states had 16 incumbents defeated. So in the June 2nd states, we're seeing more incumbents defeated than there were in 2018. This is actually the reverse of what the trend had been up until now. Before the June 2nd primaries, this year there were 8 states that had held state legislative elections. This includes some fairly large states: California, Texas, North Carolina are all included in this category. In those 8 states, there were 6 incumbents defeated in primaries. And if we look at those same 8 states and we look at what occurred in 2018 in those state legislative primaries, there were 23 state legislative incumbents. 7 of those states had fewer incumbents defeated than in 2018, while the 8th, Ohio, had no change between 2018 and 2020. So what we're seeing in these June 2nd primaries is definitely a reversal from what we had been seeing up until now in 2020, where state legislative primaries were getting less competitive for incumbents.
That's very interesting, and that will also be a trend that we'll be keeping our eye on to see whether or not the break in elections or the disruption in the election season may reflect that there was a kind of a turning point in how these voters were kind of viewing these races. So that'll be something we'll definitely be looking to keep an eye on. So thank you so much for sharing all of this really great information about what happened on Tuesday. I really appreciate your being here with us, David. Thank you.
Thanks for having me, Dave. It's been great being here.
All right, so in a traditional year, we'd be in the middle or near the end of the primary calendar, but with all of the postponements and the like, it kind of feels like we've just started. So June is shaping up to be a very busy month for elections. We've got 11 more states that will hold primaries over the next 4 weeks, and that includes 5 states next Tuesday alone, June 9th. So that'll also be a very, very busy day for us here at Ballotpedia and in the election universe. So we'll be following those results as they come in, and we invite you to check back with us at ballotpedia.org for updates through our front page, both on all the news relating to elections and all the news about politics. And of course, one way to stay on top of everything is to keep in the know with all of our email newsletters. And that includes the Daily Brew, which comes out every weekday, and our weekly newsletters, The Tap. So again, I apologize for the technical difficulties early on, but I really want to thank you for joining us and staying with us. Thank you very much for watching, everyone. Have a great day.